The 2006 Portuguese Grand Prix, held at the Circuito do Estoril, played host to the penultimate round of the 2006 MotoGP World Championship. The season had been one of the best seasons in a long time, as going into the race, 5 riders still had a mathematical shot at winning the title. However, realistically, it was between 2 riders, which were the Kentucky kid Nicky Hayden, who was fighting to win his first ever Premier Class title, and the reigning champion that season, Valentino Rossi, who had made an amazing comeback during the season after a frustrating first half of the season. Going into the race, Hayden led the standings by 12 points ahead of Rossi. And with Valley picking up a huge wave of momentum in the previous 4 races, it was expected to go down to the wire. And whilst that would happen, thanks to a dramatic moment that happened very early on in the race, there would also be another moment in the race, which whilst we didn't know it at the time, would end up having huge implications in the outcome of the championship. This is the story of the 2006 Portuguese Motorcycle Grand Prix. Since the turn of the millennium, all the way up until 2012, Estoril had hosted the Portuguese Grand Prix for MotoGP, which was something the circuit needed after Formula 1 stopped visiting the circuit after 1996 due to failed modifications for both the 1997 and 1998 races. After the 2005 running of the race was hosted earlier in the season, the 2006 running was pushed back to mid-October, hosting the penultimate race of the season, 2 weeks before the finale at Valencia. Going into the weekend, Valentino Rossi was riding a wave of momentum, as after retiring at Laguna Seca due to his engine blowing up, he would bounce back in the next 4 races to finish on the podium in all of those 4 races, with him even taking victory at Sepang after a close fight with fellow compatriot and good friend Loris Capirossi, whilst Nicky Hayden, after winning at Laguna Seca, struggled to get the measure of Rossi, with him failing to get onto the podium even with a pole position that he had at Phillip Island. And it seemed that would be the trend going into Estoril, as Rossi would take another pole position by 2/10 ahead of his teammate Colin Edwards, whilst Hayden also joined them on the front row, starting in 3rd. Pedrosa would start in 4th, whilst Capirossi was down in 10th, and the Gresini Honda of Melandri was down in 15th. Capirossi, Melandri and Pedrosa needed a miracle to keep their title hopes alive, so the focus was on Rossi and Hayden, and little did we know that the race would end up being dramatic for both riders. At the start, Rossi just held on to the lead, whilst Hayden dropped down to 4th after teammate Pedrosa made a lightning start to move up to 2nd. Around turn 4, and Shinya Nakano would get squeezed by John Hopkins, causing Shinya to have a scary high side, which thankfully, despite being stretchered away, suffered no serious injuries. Heading down to turn 1 at the start of lap 2, and Hayden makes an incredible and important move on fellow compatriot Edwards to move into the podium places, whilst Jebanar and Stoner, the man that would replace Sete at Ducati, ended up ending their races early, which led to Sete breaking his 5th metacarpal bone in his hand and also bent one of his titanium plates in his shoulder that he had as a direct result of a start crash he was involved with earlier in the season at Catalunya. This, as a result, ended up being Sete's last race in MotoGP, as he would end up missing what would have been his final MotoGP race, being replaced at the finale by World Superbike champion that year, Troy Bayliss. Back at the front, and Hayden would end up having some wheel spin coming out of turn 6, allowing Edwards to repass him for 3rd, and would then overtake Hayden's teammate Pedrosa on the following lap at the beginning of the Gancho chicane. A lap later, and Hayden, determined not to let Rossi get away, went for an ambitious move on his teammate Pedrosa at turn 6 to move back onto the podium places. However, Pedrosa, despite being an outsider in the championship compared to his teammate who was leading the standings, was not going to give up without a fight, given this was during a time before the text messaging system was implemented in the series. Throughout the remainder of the lap, and also on the following lap, Pedrosa tried everything to re-overtake his teammate. And then, at the same corner where Hayden overtook Pedrosa, Pedrosa went for an audacious move that made the championship take an unexpected twist.
It's very, very important that Nicky Hayden gets past. Oh, somebody's gone. Is it Pedrosa that's gone? Is it both the Hondas are gone? They've both gone. Hayden has gone, and the Repsol Hondas have both crashed out. Danny Pedrosa and Nicky Hayden have crashed out of the Grand Prix of Portugal.
Well, that was definitely not in the script. Seeing a gap open on the inside, Pedrosa left his braking so late that he ended up losing the front end and taking Hayden with him, sending them both out of the race. For Pedrosa, his chance of winning the title was officially over, whilst Hayden, after attempting to pick up his bike to try and get back in the race, was left dejected, angry and emotional, knowing that any chance of winning his first world title might have been in vain, given that Rossi, who was still in the race, was looking comfortable out in front. To be honest, that was probably the same reaction I gave when Nottingham Forest got their 4-point deduction this week. With Hayden out of the race, the championship was going down to the wire, and Rossi just had to bring it home to not only win the race, but also to take the lead in the standings by 13 points heading into the finale at Valencia. However, if he thought he could just cruise to the finish, he was very much mistaken. Whilst everything was kicking off at the front, Tony Elias on the Gresini Honda was climbing his way up through the field after qualifying down in 11th. And after the two Repsol Hondas came together, Elias found himself up in 3rd and was right on the back of Rossi's teammate Colin Edwards. The same couldn't be said though for his teammate Marco Melandri, as on lap 12 the Italian would make a mistake at turn 3, dropping down a few places after climbing his way up to 8th after a terrible qualifying session. This pretty much ended Melandri's title hopes, and with Capirossi continuing to drop down the order thanks to tyre issues, it looked like the championship would be only down to just Hayden and Rossi. On lap 14, Elias, after being stuck behind Edwards for many laps, would finally pass the American at the same corner the Repsol Hondas collided to split the two Yamahas and move up to 2nd. However, this wouldn't last long, as Edwards would repass Elias a few corners later, specifically at the same corner he passed Pedrosa. But Elias was not going to give up, and a lap later would pass Edwards for P2 once again at turn 6, this time making the move stick. Over the next few laps, Elias would start to create a gap to Edwards and began to set his sights on Rossi, closing the gap every lap. Whilst Elias was putting the pressure on Rossi, 2000 Premier Class champion Kenny Roberts Jr., riding a satellite Suzuki, was putting the pressure on Rossi's teammate Edwards for the final podium. Like with Elias, Roberts had also charged his way through the field after qualifying down in 13th. With 7 laps to go, Elias, after being behind Rossi for a few laps, finally made his move on the Doctor at turn 1 to take the lead. However, Rossi was not going to give up without a fight, and 2 laps later would repass Elias at turn 4. Behind them, and a lap later, Roberts, after being stuck behind Edwards for many laps, would finally pass his fellow compatriot at turn 1 to get onto the final podium spot. Gapping Edwards after he overtook him, Roberts then set his sights on the top 2, and sensing a chance at his first win since his championship winning year in 2000, Roberts makes a move on Elias at the Gancho chicane to take 2nd place. A lap later, and Roberts is able to build a gap to Elias, helped in large by Tony having a huge amount of wheel spin out of turn 3, putting him in the clutches of Edwards. With 2 laps to go, Roberts is on the back of his 2000 rival Valentino Rossi, and with a good run out of the final corner, Roberts gets the move done down the inside of Rossi at turn 1 to take the lead. In doing so, it allows Elias to once again get onto the back of Rossi, and it gives Roberts a bit of breathing space. For a moment, it looked like Roberts was finally going to get his first win since the year 2000. However, approaching the 3rd to last corner, Roberts gets a twitch on the front end, which he is forced to correct, and it allows both Rossi and Elias to get back onto the back of him. Starting the final lap of the race, Rossi tucks into the slipstream of Roberts to go down the inside of the American at turn 1. However, at the same time, Elias goes down the inside of the pair of them to perform a double move on the 2000 title contenders to retake the lead, forcing Rossi to back out and stick behind Roberts. Luckily for the Doctor, he doesn't have to wait too long to pass Roberts, as a corner later, and thanks in large to Elias compromising Kenny's exit at turn 1, Valley gets past Roberts at turn 2 to grab 2nd place. Rossi now sets his sights on grabbing the lead again from Elias, whilst Roberts has to focus on fending off Edwards for the final podium place. Going into the Gancho chicane for the final time, Rossi goes for a move down the inside of Elias but goes too deep. Elias tries to hang it around the outside at the exit of the chicane, but Rossi keeps his foot in, or in this case hand in, given the accelerator is on the handle, to retake the lead. It looks like, despite Elias' best efforts, that Rossi is going to grab the victory and give himself a comfortable lead heading into the finale. However, Elias, sensing his first ever Premier Class win, is not going to give up until the end. Coming out of the final corner, Elias gets a good run on Rossi to go side by side heading down the pit straight. Both of them crossed the line to a photo finish, and as the timing screen updated, it read that Elias had won his first ever Premier Class race by only 0.02 of a second. There was barely anything separating them as they crossed the line. Rossi did his best to hold on, but in the end, the power of the Honda engine allowed Elias to just beat him at the line, whilst behind them, Roberts fended off from Edwards to finish just under 2/10 behind both Elias and Rossi to grab what would turn out to be his final ever podium in MotoGP. It was a dramatic and exciting race which went right to the very end, and one that is still talked about to this day. Thanks to Elias winning the race, it meant that going into the finale, Rossi led the championship by 8 points ahead of Hayden, with the pair now being the only riders left who could mathematically win the title. Sadly for Rossi, he would not win his 6th consecutive Premier Class title, as despite taking pole for the finale, he would end up bogging down at the start, not only losing the lead to Troy Bayliss, who would go on to win the race, but also by the end of lap 1, he would drop down to 7th, even colliding with his rival Nicky Hayden at the start. Then on lap 5, Rossi's championship would come crashing down, as whilst trying to put pressure on future rival Casey Stoner, Rossi would lose the front end at turn 1, dropping down to the back of the pack. Even though he would get going again, he could only recover to 13th, whilst rival Nicky Hayden crossed the line in 3rd to win the 2006 MotoGP title by just 5 points ahead of Rossi, which in turn also allowed Honda to win back the Constructors title that they lost in 2005. Although Rossi lost the title that year on his own accord, one could argue that the seed for Rossi's downfall was already planted the race before. What should have been the defining moment of Rossi winning the title that season actually ended up being the defining moment of Hayden winning the title instead. Had Elias pulled out of Rossi's slipstream 0.03 of a second later, Rossi would have won the title on a countback of wins, as he would have had 6 wins compared to Hayden's 2. It is the pure definition of small margins, and small margins in this case ended up being the thing that cost Rossi from winning the 2006 title, combined with him bottling it at Valencia. Elias saved Hayden's bacon that day, and it was because of this they allowed Hayden, who was pretty much seen as an underdog, to end Rossi's streak of titles and win his one and only MotoGP title. Even 7 years after his tragic death, it's still sad that he's no longer with us. Ride on, Kentucky Kid. Ride on.